What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my 3-part video series on how to paint Marvel Crisis Protocol's Doctor Octopus. In this first video, I'm going to cover painting the Khaki Stone and Copper elements on his base. To prime my miniature, we're using Vallejo Surface Primer Black. To paint the Khaki Stone on the base, we're using AK Graphite, Scale Colors Thar Brown, Mojave White, and White Sands. To paint the copper on the base as well as the girder in one of the tentacles, we're using Scale Colors African Shadow, AK Saddle Brown, Deep Brown, Scale Colors Tenaire Yellow, Vallejo Ice Yellow, and Games Workshop Technical Nillahack Oxide. The build for Doctor Octopus is pretty straightforward. The model goes together very simple, very easily. The instructions are pretty clear. There's no way you can misbuild the tentacles. And there's no real major gaps to speak of. They've really done a very good job of putting this model together in a way that it hides a lot of the seam lines with where the armor plates meet or where the seams of the cloth meet. So not a lot of work there. However, because of the way the model goes together, especially for these tentacles, there are some pretty glaring mold lines that you have to contend with, especially on the gaps in between all the different parts of the appendages. So it's tricky to use a hobby knife for this. I highly recommend using a sandpaper or more likely sanding sponge. The softness of it, the malleability of it will let you get into these crevices and really sand down and clean the tentacles. You want to make sure that you do a good job of cleaning up those mold lines. Otherwise, it's going to be very visible in our final paint job, especially on the arms. What we're going to be doing in terms of prep work for painting, I've already primed the model, the Vallejo Surface Primer Black. And because we're going to be painting the base to match the Spider-Man, we're going to be doing an airbrush base coat of graphite onto the base stone. We're also going to be using Dark Sea Blue as a base coat for the majority of the model because we're doing a non-metal blue for the appendages, which is a major portion, and then a lot of his suit is green, which we're going to be using a Dark Sea Blue base coat. Doing that with the airbrush allows us to quickly skip that step, get a nice, clean, even coat without much effort or work on the model. So we'll start by airbrushing the graphite onto the base. Make sure we get the rubble, all the rocks and debris. And then we'll follow up with Dark Sea Blue over the rest of the model. Making sure to get a nice even base coat, especially in the crevices on the tentacles. I'm going to avoid spraying close to the base. I'll hand paint these two claws that are attached. I don't want to overspray the blue onto the gray I've already done. Before we can begin painting the base, we want to start by prepping a wash either with Nuln Oil or diluted black or an oil paint, up to you. And we're going to basically ink line these crevices and get a little bit of definition there. And the reason we're doing this first is that we can be messy along the edges. And then when we go back in and highlight or paint each of these areas, we can then clean up the lining. It's a lot easier to do this first, as opposed to painting all of the base stone and the copper and whatever, and then trying to black line afterwards. I'm using Nuln Oil for this, just because I have it on hand, and I'll probably have to do 2 or 3 coats to get a nice even pass. And basically the definition that we're looking for is something like this. So you can see how this inset line is much, much darker than the graphite and the khaki stone around it. So we're aiming for that same kind of definition on particularly the lettering and some of these bigger panels here. So once we've done that all wash prep on the base, it's time to start the khaki stone. We're going to be using 4 colors for this: AK Graphite, Thar Brown from Scale 75, Mojave White, and then we'll work up to White Sand. Now I normally only reserve this for certain particular details, and for this one we're going to be doing it on the rubble, on these extra sort of raised platforms and bases, just to have a bit of extra separation or distinction from some of the darker stone around it. So we've already done the base coat with the airbrush with graphite, and from there we're going to mix in a 50-50 mix of graphite and Thar Brown. And we're going to start base coating the stone areas. Now I'm going to use an older brush for this. I don't want a super sharp tip, and this will let me move the brush quickly across the surface, and the bigger, fatter brush strokes will help to give a texture to the relatively flat surface. I like to use the painterly strokes to help imply a bit more of a worn or broken texture. And as we paint over the surface, we're going to keep mixing in Thar Brown until we get up to pure Thar Brown. Just being nice and loose, working the brush across the surface, discovering and sort of creating textures as I go with my brush strokes. And from Thar Brown, we do the exact same, moving up to Mojave White, just progressively mixing our brighter color into our darker color and highlighting up. Now, as we're working through this process and we're creating these little clusters of color, these little patterns, we want to start highlighting them according to our light source. So I'm going to have my light source coming from where Doctor Octopus is facing, 3/4 top down, which means elements right here in the front are going to be brighter, and where there are cracks or lines I sort of discovered and painted in with my brush strokes, we're going to highlight accordingly as if they were being illuminated by a light source coming from that direction. And I apologize for the noise in the background. My cat is playing with a toy. And we're just going to keep working up this khaki stone texture, focusing on a front to back overall fade, but making sure to pay attention to the texture that we're sort of uncovering and discovering with our brush strokes, as well as making sure that we brighten up the bigger rubble pieces to provide a little extra contrast. And then we're going to finish up the final highlight of pure white sand on some of the brightest rubble pieces and debris. We're going to ignore the entire base of it. We're just looking at picking out some of these larger rocks and pieces strewn across the base. Add a little bit more pop and help them to stand out just a little bit. And again, of course, just making sure that we're highlighting consistent with our light source. And we're treating all of these little fake textures and cracks that we painted in as little edges. With the khaki stone done, it's now time to move on to painting the copper elements. And there's quite a few of it. You can see I've left it gray on the base. So it's the Oscorp text, these two rings of, I guess, C's. I guess it's supposed to be an O and a C, I don't know. And then there is a trim on the edge. And we'll be painting that to match the copper on Spider-Man's base. We're using 4 colors for this. We're using Scale Colors African Shadow, AK Saddle Brown, Deep Brown, and then AK Pastel Yellow. Essentially base coat and then a progressive highlight all the way through into pure pastel yellow. And then if you want to add a bit of verdigris or a little bit of rust, we're going to be using a bit of Nelahac oxide. You can see it a bit on the back of Spider-Man's base. The parts of this weren't large enough for me to really put a lot of dots on the surfaces, and I didn't want to do too much blue on the front here. I mainly focused it here on the bends of the rivets. But on Doctor Octopus's base, we're going to have a lot more of these flat open areas that we can start to stipple this color on. So we'll use that Nelahac oxide to add a bit of extra color to the piece. So then we're just going to start with our African shadow, and we're going to apply a nice even base coat to all of these copper elements, making sure to get the sides. So in particular, on this trim right here, we want to make sure we paint all the way to the base of the khaki. Make sure we're painting the top as well as the inner element. So be neat with this. Try not to overpaint on the khaki stone, but if you do, just go back in with your different colors, so the Mojave white, white sands, etc., and correct as necessary. Once we've applied our base coat of African shadow, we're going to start working up through saddle down, deep brown, and then into pastel yellow. So for the saddle brown and deep brown, there's not many intermediary steps I think you have to do. Maybe if you want to do a 50-50 of saddle brown African shadow, depending on how smooth you want the blend and the color transition to be, maybe you want to get away with maybe just one intermediary step, maybe two. I'm doing one right here, so I've got a 50-50 mix of my African shadow and saddle brown, but I'm not looking to be super neat with this in terms of doing a perfectly smooth blend. I want, because the copper is supposed to be beaten and worn, and there's a battle going on, so it's pretty damaged. Much like when we were painting the khaki stone, I want the surface of the material to be fairly worn. Now they've sculpted some dips and divots in the material, but it is otherwise smooth. So what I'm going to be doing as I blend up is I'm going to be using my brush to create these strokes across, almost like it's been hammered metal. I'm going to avoid doing too many dots, too many stipples of the color. So texturally, it should stand out a little bit from the stone. And so be careful when you're painting around these debris, but if you do get any sort of browns or orange tones on there, we can go back in afterwards and correct. Now remember, when you're highlighting all of this copper elements, to treat all of it like one surface. Your light source is here and your dark is here, and then work your way back, work your way through your highlights, figure out, okay, where are my basic highlights and shadows coming from? And then because this is metal, we can start to get into some sort of reflected light afterwards. So for this panel right here, I'm doing a bright to dark blend, focusing on this center part right here. And you can see I'm just pulling it into some shadows there. There is a dip right here. So we're going to get a bright panel, or a bright fold right there, a bit of a dip here, and then it'll brighten up here near the rubble where it's reflecting, and then right here where it's reflecting some of the rubble around. And then from there we can go right into our deep brown. The jump from saddle brown to deep brown is very subtle. It's mostly just a saturation change and a little bit of brightness. So we don't really need an intermediary step. Be careful not to overpaint into the surrounding areas. Now you can choose to go through each color progression over the entire base all at once and work everything up together. However, because I am doing a lot of blending for this, I find it much more relaxing for myself if I treat each individual panel separately, and I can sort of work my way, spend the time to think through the highlights and shadows of each one, rather than try and work through all of it simultaneously. It can be a little overwhelming for me. So I like to do it one at a time. If you're comfortable with it, you can do it all at once. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing in some pastel yellow with the deep brown. And I'm going to start to really focus in on refining some highlights. I'm still using my old brush for this, so my brush strokes aren't super accurate, but that's okay. I'm looking for broad areas first. I'll switch to a fine tip brush as I work my way up. As we get brighter into the pastel yellow, we're going to focus in on these sharper areas and really start to sharpen up our highlights. I'm noticing that the color is, it's a little flat. It's not quite as yellow as I would like. So I think what I'm doing is I'm going to mix in some ice yellow into this recipe. And see if that'll help to get the saturation I'm looking for. Okay, so I'm using Tenere yellow a little bit into my deep brown mix just to add a bit more of that yellow tone. Then what's happening was pastel yellow and ice yellow are still too desaturated, too much white in the mix, and it wasn't getting that nice yellowy orange tone I was looking for some of my highlights. And all I'm doing right now is I'm working my way up to pure ice yellow. And as I go brighter and brighter, I'm focusing on certain key spots where I want sort of that pop to be. Non-metal metal is all about contrasting those brights and darks, and what I'm aiming for is to have some bright brights right here, contrasted with darks around it, and then we'll probably have some mid-tones or mid-brights in some of our edges and areas adjacent to some of these rubble piles and pieces. Now I'm going to switch to my fine tip brush, and now we'll go up in the pastel yellow and start to add some sharp pop highlights. I'm going to start focusing these on our bright areas. So I'm going to have one here right where the metal crests. And run along the front edge. And then along these corners to finish this up, I'm going to put some bright spots right here for a little bit of reflected sharpness happening. Because what's probably going to happen is the ground and the copper plates around in the surrounding areas are going to bounce light back. So for example, on this edge right here, it's directly facing our light source. We're going to have a bright highlight here, and it's going to reflect some light back here. So we can afford to put a brighter highlight on this back edge as a way to represent it catching some of that reflected light. And then because we're probably going to take this edge to ice yellow or pastel yellow, we can afford to go maybe Tenaire yellow or like a Tenaire yellow Sahara yellow on the back. Remember that your bounce light or your reflected light, it's always going to be darker than your light source. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about this even in advance, and that's the one advantage to be able to do all of it at once. I guess you're more able to uniformly control the value across all the pieces simultaneously. I'm just going to add some scratches here, a little bit more surface wear and tear. I'm going to put a bright highlight right here in the crevice where these two plates will meet, because we're going to get some light reflecting off of this panel into here, and then it's bouncing back because of the way it's a V, a little bit of a valley here. And some of the colors are khaki and white sands on our palette. We'll just correct up some of these edges. And then to add a bit of verdigris and a bit of rust onto this, we're going to take our Nilahak oxide. And then you can think about where the rust would collect, depending on how long you think this rubble has been here. I think this battle is fairly recent, so I don't think we're going to get the verdigris because of some of the dips and divots that would exist here because they haven't been around long enough to collect the water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on areas where it may be a little flatter, but it's been pockmarked from use just over time, and you get little dots of color or lots of water that collect and pool on the surface and just rust over time. Now this color is fairly desaturated, and not desaturated, it's not desaturated, translucent, transparent. It's not a very strong or intense color right out of the pot. You're going to need to do several coats to really build up the vibrancy of the blue. So we can go ahead and just do that on all of the copper elements on the base. And we're going to paint the girder that's being held by one of these tentacles in the same way as we paint the copper on the base. I chose to focus a lot of the rust into the crevices of the angles where I think the water would naturally collect, and not so much where he's clamping. And with the copper on the base painted, all that's left is to take some black, paint the base trim, and then we can move on to the rest of the model. To get a nice smooth finish on the trim, make sure that your paint is semi-diluted. I'm doing about, not quite half-half, 70-30 paint to water. And you're going to want to do 2 or 3 nice thin passes over the entire trim, and that'll give you a nice clean finish without any real visible brush strokes. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and follow for more awesome weekly content. I'll have links for my other social media platforms in the video descriptions below. Until next time, happy hobbying.